Here I just want to take a look at how to use variables. Now I'm setting up a variable here. It's in the script section, and I've declared it as a variable called num for number. Notice I've started with the keyword var. That's required when I'm declaring variables. Now variables are, in effect, they're like labeled boxes that I can put values into. So let's create another variable, txt. So one of these is going to be a number and the other is going to be a string. That's a piece of text. In JavaScript, I don't have to declare them as a particular type. In many other languages, I would have to put the type declaration when I declare the variables. And once it's a string, it can only be a string. Once it's a number, an integer, it could only be a number. That's not the case in JavaScript. Incidentally, if you want to create a list of variables, there's an alternative syntax. You can just put var and then the names of the variables and divide each variable name with a comma. And I like to end my declarations with a semicolon. The semicolons are not always necessary in JavaScript, but they're common in most other languages, and I'm used to semicolons, and I'm going to stick with that tradition. Right, now I've declared my variables and can now assign values to them. I assign a value by putting the variable name. The name, by the way, is up to you. You can choose a descriptive name, whatever seems sensible for the description of the variable. When you assign a value, use an equal sign. That's what I'm doing now. So I've got a num, and I'll assign it 10. That's an integer value 10, and txt, that's intended to be a string. So I use my string delimiters, a pair of double quotes in this case. You can use single quotes as well, but I'm going to stick with double for now. A dozen is. Now you'll see why I've put that shortly. I'm going to write the output into a web page using document.write and a pair of parentheses. And now instead of putting a string, a literal string in here, I'm going to put the variables. So I can put, now let's put text first, txt plus num. Now here the plus operator concatenates two values, and in fact JavaScript also takes care of converting the number into a string, so I don't have to do an explicit conversion. If you've done programming in other languages, you know that very often in many languages, if you want to display an integer as a string in somewhere like a text box, or in this case on a web page, you would have to convert it explicitly. Well, JavaScript knows when you're trying to concatenate it to a string that you want to display it. So let me just save my file, see how far we've got here. I now navigate to the directory in which I've stored the file. It's called vartest.html. Double click it to open it up, and there it says a dozen is 10. Well, of course that's not correct. It should be a dozen is 12. So let me see why it says a dozen is 10. Well, of course my variable is 10, so I really wanted to add 2 to that variable. So let me try that now and see if that has the desired result. Go back into the browser and refresh. Oops, it says a dozen is 102. So why is that? Go back again to check my code. Now this is because I've used these two plus operators. And remember I said they concatenate. They concatenate to create a string. So in this case, I've got my txt variable, and it is a string, a dozen is. My num variable, which is an integer 10, and that's displayed as a string. So it says a dozen is 10. And then I've added on 2. So I've got a dozen is 10 plus 2. That's the character 2, and that's not what I intended at all. I meant to add 2 onto the integer, that is, to get num, which is 10, and add 2 to it. A simple way to fix that is to put a pair of parentheses around this. So now this tells JavaScript, do this operation inside the parentheses. Well, num and 2 are now both integers, so JavaScript should, I hope, work out that my intention is to add those two together and then the result being 12, it should append the value 12 as a string to the variable txt. Let's see if I'm right in my assumption that that is what it's going to do. Refresh again. Hurrah! And this time it does what I intended. Now before leaving this is a very simple introduction to variables, but there's one other thing that I want to explain. And that is that having no pre-declared types, my variables can change their type in the course of this program. So I've got num, and I intended it to be an integer, but there's nothing that tells JavaScript it has to be an integer. And in fact, I can change that into something else. Let me put in a string. And txt, I'd intended that to be a string, but it could be an integer. Let me make it 100. And now, if I attempt to display those variables, let me see, I'll put in a break character first so that we have a line break to distinguish it from the previous display, the other document right. And then I put in the num variable, I append it to the string, followed by the txt variable. Put my semicolon at the end, save it, and let's see what we've got this time. Refresh, and here, this is what we have. So let's see how this maps onto the code. So as before, I've got the document write statement up here, and that writes in a dozen is, that's the string, plus the result of adding 2 to the value of num, which is 12, a dozen is 12. Then I've got the second document write further down, but this time num, which remember was a number, was an integer, I've assigned it a string value. And txt, which was a string, I've assigned an integer value. And that's what it displays here. It says the first variable is num, and that is now a string, and it displays hello. The second variable is txt, that's now an integer, and it displays 100. So I've changed the data types of those two variables in just a few lines of code. That's one consequence of not having explicit typing in JavaScript, and it has some uses, but be careful. It's very easy for you to assume that an integer that you've created early on in your code and which you've assigned a specific data type, for example num is assigned 10, so it's an integer, it's easy to assume it retains that type. So you could later on try to do some sort of mathematical operation, but now it's a string. So bear in mind that that is a pitfall that you could easily fall into. So take great care when working with variables that you really have data of the type you think you have. Learn programming and the business of programming at www.bitwisecourses.com.